Hi, folks. Now we're talking about Chapter 16, Varieties of Sexual Expression. And it's really the best way to describe it, I would say, to break it down, really is it's about sexual deviance. And so we're talking about behavior that is in violation of social norms. And we talk about social norms within sociology, that there's a process, socialization, and within that social control, socialization is the process wherein we become human and we learn and adopt the characteristics of the group and society. And so we basically, with how we're socialized, we learn how to fit in. Social control is a part of that. We know that we have rules that we have to follow. We're taught these rules, we're expected to follow them, and we're forced to follow them. We're forced to comply. Societies are designed to produce conforming individuals. That's one of the main ways of sort of looking at the socialization and how it happens and how we benefit from it. So, from the socialization process and from the social control aspect of it, we realize, hey, there's stuff we really should not do. There are things that we should not do. And we, no matter if we've never really entertained these thoughts of doing the particular activity or deed or not, we know that there are shunned things, that there are things that are not to be done or to be expressed, if you will, in some sort of committed act. And so that's where deviant behavior lies, in those, if you will, outside of that recognized protected confines of space socially. And so, yes, we have these rules. And so a lot of times, especially with a chapter like this, we think, well, that's not fair, and there's labels and this and that, and well, they didn't know. And granted, a lot of that is certainly relevant. And so what is deviant at one point often becomes normative. So with society is likely to change during our lifetime, and has on a number of different issues with respect to deviant behavior and what is thought of to be deviant sexually. We've gone from very, very rigid ways of looking at it to ways that are much more nuanced and more fluid, much like, again, that continuum of human sexuality. But nevertheless, notions of fairness, notions of, well, the person didn't know, to a very large extent, it's our responsibility to know what the rules are and that we need to follow them, because if we don't, there are going to be consequences. And so, again, this is often where we see ultimately the more consistent consequences for such behavior as given and directed by society. In fact, in some of the earliest legal actions taking place, or that took place in our country and our government, had to do with bestiality cases, or cases, for instance, that were tried for deviant acts against animals or with animals. And so some of the early laws and the early efforts legally were committed to cases wherein this had been alleged to have occurred. And so there's a great book about these and other tidbits about our history as a country from D'Amelio and Friedman's book, Intimate Matters. Really, really great book for a lot of this stuff. So again, sexual deviance is often something that we can see defined early in society. Early in the sense that it's often within the groundwork or the brickwork. It's within the true structure, the true sort of DNA of society. Think about that, how early our republic, just in the early days, I should say, of the republic starting, and immediately colonists saying, we can't do this. And again, of course, we learned about that, the history of the original 13 colonies and the Puritans and so forth. And so, yeah, they were coming here to escape those excesses that they saw happening in Europe. And the idea was, hey, we need to be moral, because if we're not, we're already going to be damned from the womb if we don't do something about it. So, again, deviant behavior, we know that it matters and that it will be sanctioned negatively in one way or another, depending on the kind of behavior we're talking about. Now, ultimately, these behaviors are defined and termed paraphilias. We're looking at, by definition, a word that refers to the attraction to the deviant. And so we're looking at a craving that is unusual and potentially problematic. And really, the problematic aspect of that definition is really what matters. It's not, oh, that's bad or oh, that's yucky, because again, what one person's yucky is another person's freak or kink. And then also, of course, too, society changes. And so we've seen that before with respect to the human sexuality continuum. So it's really the issue of the problem, the fact that if the person is so committed to the behavior that this may ruin their life. And so that's what we're talking about, that these sexually deviant behaviors, they ruin friendships, marriages, they ruin relationships, they ruin reputations ultimately. And so in the commission of these acts, that's ultimately what you really want to sort of understand. And research shows that those who are sexually deviant paraphiliacs, that they have a higher tolerance for inappropriate behavior. And so we all, and again, this goes back to the sociology of deviance. We all have the potential rather to be deviant, and can be at points where it often suits us. But again, we're looking here at circumstances where the potential for harm outweighs the potential for good. And so even when people are tempted to be deviant, we do that sort of cost-benefit analysis. Well, I could do this, but this will lead to more trouble and more consequences that I don't want to face. When we're looking at paraphilia and paraphiliac behaviors, we're looking at folks who may not really truly understand or be committed to perceiving the consequences. And so that's what we're talking about. Again, this is still within the realm of behavior that's treated by clinicians, clinical social workers, counselors, psychologists, psychiatrists, and the like. So these are often very difficult conditions to treat because, again, as we've said before, the individual has a high tolerance for inappropriate behavior. The thrill is often what they seek. And so a lot of this that I'm talking about, research, the findings come from Seligman and Hardenberg. They had a great publication back in 2000 that addressed a lot of these concerns, what would make someone do these kinds of things. And so what they found is that there were a range of motivations that were sexual and non-sexual, that, hey, people just might want to do it for thrills. And so we see this a lot, unfortunately. Here in Michigan, we have some super centers, like in the vast majority of the country now, I should say. It's not necessarily that unique, but there's a pattern here where there are super centers, unique super centers that you tend to find mostly in Midwest states, like Michigan, where people are often accused of these kinds of behaviors, for instance. And so, again, the environment of certain settings allows for them to be thrill seekers and allows for them to take, in a sense, command and control of those areas. And so there's, again, a supercenter here where there are often reports of this behavior happening somewhere in the public view of all the patrons there. And again, this is often the environment that this kind of paraphiliac craves. They often want that anonymity. They want that sort of institutional environment. They want something McDonaldized like that, like a supercenter, because they can easily dart in, make their scene, and then leave, or something like that. And so this is often something that we find in a lot of those sorts of environments. And so again, the structure of society is also relevant to the expression of these behaviors as well. It's not simply that the individual has the motivation. They, again, have some kind of cultural experience that validates the expression of the deviant behavior. So there are a number of these categorically that are of broad-based category. There are a number of subtypes as well. It seems like there's a new paraphilia or a new, if you will, sexual craving every week. But we're dealing here with the DSM established criteria, if you will, for the mental illnesses that are deemed paraphilias. And so some of these include fetish, and so this is where an object has ultimately become the sexual partner. So it's not simply the presence of the object. It's not, well, it does come down to that, yes, but the individual who's truly a fetishist has to have that, has to have or be in possession of that particular kind of thing in order to have arousal and orgasm. It's not just a once or twice spicing up of things or changing of things that might involve unique materials, gloves, rubber, boots, shoes. It's not just having something like that or a unique outfit once or twice. It's about having to have that, having to have domination over it, control over it in such that it is in your possession and that it can be seen and used as a sexual object. So when those things are desired out of proportion to what is healthy, if those are desired to the extent that it may threaten someone's job or career or threaten their relationship or their ability to have relationships, that's really what we're talking about. It's that degree of interest in the fetish that would be the problem. We're also talking about sadism and masochism, so these are often paired, if you will, sexually deviant paraphilias, wherein the sadist wants to inflict pain, the masochist wants to receive pain. And there are a number of subcultures and groupings within society that blur the lines of, well, how much of this is truly a paraphilia and how much of this is just subcultural. And so, in a lot of respects, I would say much of what we see advertised as S&M and such is subcultural. But in these truly what I would say challenged S&M circumstances, we're looking at pain and the receiving of pain that go beyond the bounds of what is healthy. And so if we're looking at subcultural forms of S&M, that's one thing. There are boundaries established in such groups. That's different from what we're talking about here. Here we're looking at truly issues of power and domination and control, where the person in the dominant role, they want to completely dominate that person that is indeed their subordinate in ways that may truly bring about the death or the harm of the subordinate, or even bring about such for the dominant. So we're looking at those kinds of circumstances truly being dangerous, where the danger, the thrill, the true commitment to the danger is what brings about the sexual deviant, if you will, circumstance. We're also looking at voyeurism, those who are peeping toms, so to speak. We often see the more modern application of this known as upskirting, where people may use small cameras, camera phones, or phones, I should say, on cameras, to take pictures of unsuspecting victims, if you will, or survivors from the experiences in ways that are sexually provocative and meant to ultimately dominate and control that person's body and the image of that person's body. And so these are the kinds of things that you can see happening in areas of great anonymity, malls, shopping centers. During the COVID-19 crisis that we're in, obviously there may be a quelling of such behaviors, but they may have also, if you will, a lot of these behaviors may have also, now they may take more place, if you will, in residential settings as opposed to more anonymous settings. We're also looking at those who are exhibitionists, and often the voyeuristic and exhibitionistic activity can go together, so they can be comorbid. A person may have both expressions at the same time. And again, they may fuel and feed each other as well. So the often standard view of the exhibitionist is that that person is a flasher, that they're flashing themselves. And so they may, for instance, stand in a window or stand in a patio door or door wall, so to speak, in full view of people within the neighborhood that walk by, and they may wave, and then while they're waving, they may also be pleasuring themselves or touching themselves. And again, it's the impulsivity that the person may have, and so this is something that Seligman and Hardenberg found as well, that often these individuals with paraphiliac behaviors, they often have very strong impulse control disorders, and so they feel the urge and are compelled to commit to the urge far more than what is healthy. And so again, in full view, they may be in a window, at the door, waving the folks, and then at the same time pleasuring themselves. And in so doing, they may they often tend not to care about the consequences or do not perceive the consequences, and this is what ultimately gets them into trouble. One thing we often have found in the research about voyeurism too is that the person who's committed to, in the case of being a voyeur, they may run once they're discovered or detected, obviously, and then where they go and rest or hide out, they may relive the fantasy again by pleasuring themselves. So this is something that happens. It allows them sort of to relive the fantasy over and over again. Other examples, of course, pedophilia, so those who have a sexual craving for children. The more adolescent form of that is ephebophilia. But nevertheless, we're looking at adults that want to dominate the sexuality and control the bodies of children and minors. And this is a craving that ultimately does not consider that these indeed are minors that cannot consent. In fact, their idea, those who are truly committed pedophiliacs, is that there is no need to worry about consent, and that there are subcultures that are committed to demystifying and trying to make pedophilia, in a sense, okay and normative, but it is incredibly controversial to say the least. Of the paraphilias, exhibitionism, voyeurism, pedophilia, and frotteurism are the four most common. Frotterers are those who want to rub up against people who are unsuspecting and not participatory with respect to sex. They want to rub up against them, grind up against them, or touch them in a way that is sexual and is for their sexual gratification, where they're imposing it on the person that they are rubbing up against. And so you'll see this a lot in very crowded conditions, subways, for instance, airports, and even paramedics in some cases have been found to be, if you will, committed to this sort of thing. Just again, because in that case the paramedic would have access to the person's body. And so there's a case I can think of out in New York where a man had been just over and over again arrested for this, and to the point where the cops would watch for him on the days that his trial was, or that he would be released, I should say, either from trial or from jail. And they would watch for him to get back on the subway because they knew he would be right back at it. And so anytime there was sort of that rapid fire recommitted act, that they knew that this was the person to look for. So so we're looking at, again, that kind of commitment and that kind of fervor for behavior that is truly sexually threatening to other individuals and to other people. Other examples we can talk of include necrophilia, those who prefer intercourse or some kind of sexual experience with corpses or someone in a moribund or dead-like state, and also gerontophilia, those who want to impose their will sexually on old folks. So again, we're looking at the paraphiliac, the sexually deviant person, wanting to impose his or her will, and overwhelmingly it's male will imposed on some minor or regardless, someone who is disempowered in the moment. And oh yes, I should not, I think I'd be remiss if I left out telephone scatologia, obscene phone calls. And so this is often done in combination with other kinds of paraphilias, for instance, voyeurism, for instance, can be done with combination with telephone scatologia. And again, we're talking about obscene phone calls where this is really truly the way that the person achieves arousal and orgasm, and again, committing to such beyond the interest or the consent of the other person. And so I can think of a case where, and this was even fairly recently, in spite of technological developments that may make this more difficult. Again, we don't have home phones in use as much and phone books in use as much. The randomization of, oh, I can just call this person and they'll be there. It's harder to reach people that way, but nevertheless, I can think of a case that had happened in the 2000s, I want to say the 2010s, where A woman had paid for a bill at a grocery store, and the clerk at the register noted that the phone number was on the check and was able to use that in later exchange with the victim to call the woman and to talk about what she had worn the last time she had been at the store and harass her in ways that were threatening, that made her very uncomfortable, but also willing to consent to, if you want to call it that. Obviously, it's not consent, but she was forced to comply per his insatiable need to do this. And so it was easy for the police in her area, in her district, to deduce that this happened by this clerk. And not long after he was released, he called her again. And so this is a great example, again, of the inability to avoid touching a hot stove. And again, this is one of the reasons why clinicians may not necessarily be as interested in treating such individuals, because there's a high rate of recidivism. We also cannot leave out the zoos, or bestiality, those who prefer sexual intercourse with animals. And so again, we're looking at the prospect of, again, a dominant submissive circumstance, again, where the dominant person here, the individual, wants to completely dominate and control the body of the animal, or the beast, so to speak. And as in the case of S&M and pedophilia, there are indeed subcultures of zoos that have cropped up, or perhaps have always been around regardless of human history. So there's a good documentary called Zoo that gets into one such subculture, one such group of zoos who got together on a fairly regular basis on weekends, and who were, of course, very, very interested in, upon the death of one of the members of their group, who died when having sex with a horse, and it was referred to as the Enumclaw horse sex case, involving Kenneth Pinion, who was a member of the group and was a Boeing aerospace engineer. So, very good documentary for just sort of understanding the subcultural aspects of zoo, and how some people do consider it as a sexual orientation. Very controversial, but again, very little within human sexuality lacks controversy.